He built a 9-figure empire out of a $10,000 loan from his childhood best friend. He put his own name on the back pocket of a pair of jeans and sold 200,000 of them in a single week. And then, at the height of it all, with his name on every billboard in Times Square, he nearly lost everything to a mountain of debt he didn't even fully understand. You would think a kid from a grocery store in the Bronx, with no family money and no connections to the world of 7th Avenue, could never survive something like that, right? Well, Calvin Klein didn't just survive it. He came back from the edge of bankruptcy and built one of the most recognizable names in the history of fashion, a brand that would eventually sell for something close to $700 million. He would take 3 simple letters, CK, and turn them into a symbol that meant something on every continent on Earth. So how does a shy, sketching kid from a Bronx grocery store end up staring down financial ruin and coming out the other side as the most famous designer in America? To understand that, we have to go back to a narrow, crowded apartment near Mosholu Parkway in the Bronx in the 1940s. Calvin Richard Klein was born on November 19, 1942, the son of a Hungarian immigrant named Leo Klein, who spent his days behind the counter of a small grocery store up in Harlem. Leo worked long hours, the kind of hours that grocers work, up before dawn, home after dark, hands rough from stacking crates and weighing produce. Calvin would visit him at the store as a boy, learning how to price merchandise, watching his father add up totals in his head. It was, in its own quiet way, his first business school. His mother, Flor, was a homemaker of Polish-Jewish heritage, and she had a mother of her own, Calvin's grandmother Molly, who ran a small tailoring shop. And it was there, among the pins and the bolts of fabric and the hum of a sewing machine, that something in young Calvin Klein clicked into place. You see, while the other boys in his middle-class Jewish neighborhood were out playing stickball and chasing each other around the block, Calvin Klein was inside, sewing, sketching. He was, by his own description, a loner, quiet, observant. He noticed things other kids didn't notice: the drape of a coat, the line of a collar, the way a dress could either hide a woman's body or reveal it. While his peers dreamed about baseball, he was designing garments in a notebook. This was the flaw the world would see in him for years to come. Not tough enough, not commercial enough, a dreamer with a sketchpad instead of a business plan. A grocer's son from the Bronx with delicate hands and an eye for fabric wasn't exactly what 7th Avenue was looking for. Money was never abundant in the Klein household. Leo worked long shifts at the grocery store just to keep the family comfortable, and nobody in that apartment near Mosholu Parkway was under any illusion that fashion design was a practical career path. It was a neighborhood of butchers and bakers and shopkeepers, not artists. And yet, in that very ordinariness, in the smell of the grocery store and the rhythm of a working-class Bronx childhood, Calvin Klein was quietly absorbing lessons about value, about pricing, about what people were willing to pay for and why. He didn't know it yet, but watching his father run that grocery counter was teaching him something no design school ever could. That great taste means nothing if you can't also run a business. But somebody believed in him. His grandmother Molly took him seriously when nobody else did, letting him watch her work, showing him what it meant to actually construct a garment rather than just imagine one. And that early apprenticeship, however informal, however small, would end up shaping the entire rest of his life. He earned his diploma at the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, and from there enrolled at the Fashion Institute of Technology, the legendary FIT, the school that has launched more American design careers than perhaps any other institution in the country. Klein had found his people. But finding your people and finding your path are two very different things. And Calvin Klein was about to learn just how brutal the fashion industry could be to a young man with talent but no name. In 1962, fresh out of FIT, Klein landed an apprenticeship with a coat manufacturer named Dan Milstein, working for $75 a week. $75 a week, sketching designs copied from the European runways, sitting in the front rows of the Paris couture shows just to steal ideas for a mid-market American coat company. I learned a lot, Klein would later admit, because he threw me into the snake pit. That's not exactly a glowing review of the experience. It was cutthroat. It was exhausting. And for 5 long years, Klein bounced between design jobs on 7th Avenue, learning the machinery of the industry from the inside, but never once getting the chance to put his own name on anything. 5 years. Think about that for a moment. 5 years of designing other people's visions, watching other men's names go on the label, wondering if his own talent would ever be more than a footnote in somebody else's success story. By the mid-1960s, Calvin Klein could have easily settled into a comfortable, anonymous career as a mid-level 7th Avenue designer. Nobody would have blamed him. That's what most people in his position did. But Klein wasn't most people. And he had one thing going for him that almost nobody else in the garment district had: Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz had grown up with Klein back in the Bronx. They'd known each other since childhood, 2 Jewish kids from working-class families who trusted each other in a way that only decades of friendship can build. And in 1968, when Barry Schwartz took over his own family's grocery business, he did something that would change fashion history forever. He handed Calvin Klein $10,000 and told him to go start his own label. $10,000. That was it. That was the entire founding capital of what would eventually become a fashion empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Klein rented a small showroom in the York Hotel at 488 7th Avenue, right in the heart of Manhattan's garment district. He and Schwartz set up shop with almost nothing but a handful of coat samples and an enormous amount of nerve. And then, in a moment that sounds almost too cinematic to be true, fate intervened. Donald O'Brien, the vice president of the department store Bonwit Teller, happened to be walking through the York Hotel on his way to an entirely different meeting. He stopped in, he looked at Klein's coat samples, and right there, on the spot, he placed an order. That single chance encounter would become the origin story of Calvin Klein Limited. Within a year, the tiny company had done $1 million in sales. By 1971, that number had climbed to $5 million. A grocer's son and a grocer's son, because let us not forget, Barry Schwartz's family sold groceries too, had built, in just 3 years, a real business with real revenue on the most competitive street in American fashion. Imagine being in Klein's shoes that day. No appointment, no warning. Just a buyer wandering in off the street, flipping through a rack of samples that represented every dollar Barry Schwartz had handed over. One bad impression, one moment of nerves, and that order never gets placed. But Klein's coats spoke for themselves. Clean lines, careful tailoring. The same instinct for restraint that his grandmother Molly had nurtured in that little tailoring shop years earlier. It was, in hindsight, the first real proof that the quiet kid from the Bronx actually belonged on 7th Avenue. However, $1 million in coat sales does not make you a legend. It makes you a promising young designer. And the fashion establishment, the critics, the buyers, the editors who had spent decades looking to Paris for their cues, still weren't entirely sure what to make of this quiet young man from the Bronx. Would he be a footnote, a one-hit coat company that flamed out after a good few seasons, the way so many small 7th Avenue labels did? In 1973, Klein answered that question emphatically. He won the Coty American Fashion Critics Award, the single most prestigious honor in American fashion at the time, becoming the youngest designer ever to receive it. He wouldn't stop there. He would go on to win it again in 1974 and again in 1975, an unprecedented 3-year sweep that landed him in the Coty Hall of Fame, again as the youngest designer ever inducted. The grocer's son, who used to sketch alone in his bedroom, was now, by the industry's own official measure, the most decorated young talent in the country. But recognition from critics is one thing. Building a company that could survive decades of change in a brutal, trend-driven industry is another thing entirely. Klein knew that if he wanted to become something bigger than a celebrated name in a fashion magazine, he needed to keep pushing, keep innovating, keep finding the next category nobody else had claimed. And in the mid-1970s, he found it, denim. You have to understand, in the 1970s, jeans were workwear. They were what you wore to paint a fence or fix a car. No designer had ever put his own name on the back pocket of a pair of blue jeans and dared to sell them at a premium. It sounded almost absurd. Why would anyone pay extra for jeans with a name stitched on the pocket? But Klein saw something the rest of the industry didn't. He saw that denim could be sexy. He saw that denim could be status. And in 1978, with the manufacturing muscle of a company called Puritan Fashions behind him, he launched Calvin Klein jeans. The response was, frankly, insane. Klein claimed to have sold 200,000 pairs in the very first week. Within months, factories were producing 2 million pairs a month just to keep up with demand. When Klein held his fall 1978 fashion show, 700 buyers and journalists were turned away at the door because there simply wasn't room. The buyers who did make it inside placed $28 million worth of orders within 48 hours. $28 million in 2 days for jeans. By 1981, Fortune magazine estimated Klein's personal annual income at $8.5 million. The grocer's son from the Bronx, the quiet kid who used to sketch dresses while other boys played stickball, was now one of the wealthiest young men in American fashion. But Klein wasn't finished pushing boundaries, because in 1980, he was about to do something with those jeans that would make him the single most talked about name in the entire country. He hired 15-year-old actress Brooke Shields, and working with legendary photographer Richard Avedon, he shot a series of denim commercials that would become instantly, unforgettably notorious. In one spot, Shields looked into the camera and delivered the line, "You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Critics called the ad sexually suggestive. Some local television affiliates for ABC, NBC, and CBS pulled the commercial off the air entirely. It was banned in certain countries. Parents were outraged. Editorial boards wrote furious letters. And here's the thing you have to understand about Calvin Klein by this point in his career. Controversy didn't sink him. Controversy built him. Customers flooded into stores asking for the Brooke Shields jeans by name. Sales climbed even higher than before. Klein himself would later admit to Shields, decades afterward, that the ad put the company on the map. It was a masterclass in a strategy Klein would use again and again throughout his career, a strategy he'd later sum up in one blunt sentence. The only way to advertise is by not focusing on the product. He wasn't selling denim. He was selling desire, attitude, an entire identity you could zip yourself into. By the early 1980s, Calvin Klein wasn't just a designer anymore. He was a cultural phenomenon. And you'd think, at this point, that the story would simply be a straight line upward from here. More jeans, more perfume, more billboards, more money. But this is where things would take a dark and complicated turn. because the very company that had made him famous, Puritan Fashions, was about to become the thing that nearly destroyed him. Here's what most people don't realize about the golden age of Calvin Klein jeans. Klein and Schwartz didn't fully own the company producing them. Puritan Fashions did, and Puritan only held a minority stake belonging to Klein and Schwartz themselves. By 1982, Puritan's total sales sat at $245 million, and licensed Calvin Klein products accounted for roughly 94% of that entire figure. In other words, Calvin Klein was making one company enormously rich, and he wasn't fully in control of it. So in November of 1983, Klein and Schwartz made a bold, almost reckless decision. They bought out nearly all the remaining shares of Puritan Fashions for $65,800,000, financing the purchase through a leveraged buyout, meaning they borrowed heavily against the very company they were trying to acquire. The consolidated business was renamed Calvin Klein Industries. On paper, it looked like a triumphant power move, the designer finally seizing full control of his own name. But the timing could not have been worse. The designer jeans craze that had made Klein rich in the late 70s was cooling off fast, and Puritan lost $11,300,000 in 1984 alone. To keep the lights on, Calvin Klein Industries turned to one of the most notorious financial figures of the entire decade, Michael Milken of Drexel Burnham Lambert, the so-called junk bond king. The company issued $80 million in high-yield, high-risk debt just to stay afloat. Klein had gone from grocer's son to fashion royalty to a man drowning in junk bonds in the span of about 15 years. And he would later describe, in interviews, the crushing personal pressure of those years, sleepless nights, the terrifying sense that his name, his life's work, could collapse under a mountain of debt that he had never fully wanted to take on in the first place. "I've experienced tremendous fear and failure," Klein admitted, and if you know anything about how private and guarded he usually was, you understand what it cost him to say that publicly. Puritan clawed its way back to profitability in 1985, earning $12,400,000, and for a moment it looked like the crisis had passed. But the underlying debt problem never really went away. It just went quiet, waiting. Because in 1992, nearly a decade after that leveraged buyout, the bill finally came due. Calvin Klein Industries found itself staring at $62 million in junk bond debt, inherited directly from that original Puritan buyback. $62 million of obligations sitting on top of a fashion company that, however famous its name might be, simply did not have the cash to cover it. Bankruptcy, real, total, company-ending bankruptcy, was no longer a distant fear. It was a real and present possibility. Everything Klein had built, the coats, the jeans, the perfume counters, the billboards in Times Square with his name 40 feet tall, all of it was on the line. If the debt couldn't be restructured, if a buyer or a lender couldn't be found, the company that bore his own name could be liquidated, sold off in pieces to pay creditors. The man who had once turned a $10,000 loan into an American fashion empire was now, at 50 years old, at genuine risk of losing that empire entirely. This is where an old friendship, not unlike the one that started it all with Barry Schwartz, would end up saving Calvin Klein's life's work. David Geffen, the music mogul and longtime friend of Klein's, stepped in and helped bail the company out of that $62 million hole. Geffen's intervention did more than just buy time. It helped Klein restructure the business, including licensing the underwear division to a company called Wannaco, a move that would soon become one of the most profitable decisions of Klein's entire career. You have to sit with that for a second. A man who'd built a fashion dynasty, whose name was printed on more waistbands in America than perhaps any other designer alive, was rescued from ruin by a phone call to a friend. It's almost the exact same story as 1968, isn't it? Someone who believed in Calvin Klein, someone who trusted him enough to hand over serious money at the exact moment he needed it most. Barry Schwartz had done it with $10,000 in a hotel showroom. Now, David Geffen was doing it with tens of millions in a boardroom a quarter century later. But would that rescue be enough? Financial bailouts buy you time. They don't rebuild your reputation, and they certainly don't rebuild your revenue on their own. Calvin Klein still had to prove to his creditors, to the retail world, and honestly to himself, that his creative instincts still had another act left in them. He would find that next act in a bottle, not the kind that got him into trouble, though we'll get to that, but a bottle of fragrance. In 1994, right in the middle of this financial rebuilding period, Klein launched something nobody in the fragrance industry had quite dared to do before, a truly unisex scent, marketed with zero regard for the traditional boundaries between men's and women's fragrance. He called it CK1. My aim, Klein would later explain, was to launch a cool, universal fragrance without taking into consideration age, race, or sex. The campaign, shot in stark black and white by photographer Steven Meisel, featured a cast of models who looked nothing like the glossy, over-polished fragrance ads of the era. Kate Moss, Stella Tennant, and others, shot with a raw, almost documentary honesty that felt completely new. The results were staggering. CK1 brought in more than $5 million in sales in its first 10 days alone. At its peak, the fragrance was selling at a rate of 20 bottles every single minute. Annual revenue from the scent would climb to roughly $90 million by the mid-1990s. Klein hadn't just launched a successful perfume. He had essentially invented an entire new category of the fragrance industry, the unisex scent, one that companies are still chasing to this day. This is the moment where you start to see the shape of the man clearly. Calvin Klein, the company, had nearly drowned in debt just 2 years earlier. And here was Calvin Klein, the designer, betting the company's comeback on an idea so unconventional that most executives would have killed it in the boardroom. A scent with no gender, minimalist packaging, models who looked like real people instead of retouched fantasies. It shouldn't have worked according to conventional wisdom. It worked spectacularly. But by this point in the story, I think you already sense that nothing about Calvin Klein's career was ever going to be a smooth, uninterrupted victory lap. Because just as the company was clawing its way back to full strength, riding the success of CK1 and a resurgent underwear and sportswear business, Klein would walk directly into the most damaging controversy of his entire career. In 1995, Calvin Klein launched a jeans advertising campaign shot once again by Steven Meisel. This time, the ads featured young models in a plain wood-paneled room, being asked suggestive questions by an off-camera male voice, in a style that critics immediately compared to amateur pornography. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Child welfare advocates, the Catholic League, and the Conservative American Family Association all threatened a nationwide boycott. Then, President Bill Clinton publicly condemned the campaign as outrageous, accusing it of manipulating children. A preliminary FBI investigation was opened to determine whether the images crossed the line into child exploitation. Klein pulled the ads almost immediately and issued a public apology. The Justice Department's Child Exploitation and Obscenity section formally investigated the campaign, and ultimately, the charges were dropped once it was proven that every model involved was, in fact, of legal age. But the damage to Klein's public standing was real, and it came at the worst possible time, right as he was trying to rebuild trust with retailers, investors, and the American public after the near bankruptcy of just a few years earlier. And if that weren't enough, Klein's personal life was unraveling right alongside his professional one. He had already checked himself into a rehabilitation center in Minnesota back in 1988 to confront a serious struggle with drug and alcohol abuse. Now, in the mid-1990s, with his company's finances repaired, but his public image under fire, those old struggles resurfaced. He would eventually check into rehab again, this time in Arizona, successfully completing treatment during an especially turbulent stretch of his life, one that coincided with major upheaval inside the company itself. Think about everything stacked on this one man's shoulders at once. A company that had nearly gone bankrupt just a few years earlier, a national controversy that put him in front of federal investigators, a personal battle with addiction that he was fighting, quite literally, in the public eye. Any one of those alone could have ended a career. Calvin Klein was facing all three at the same time. Would he survive it? Would the name Calvin Klein still mean luxury and desire and American style? Or would it become permanently associated with scandal and financial instability? Nobody, including Klein himself, could have said for certain in 1995. But here's what actually happened next. He doubled down on doing the one thing he had always done well. He designed. He kept building the brand's core businesses, underwear, fragrance, sportswear, with the same minimalist instinct that had defined his best work from the very beginning. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, he would famously say. And through the back half of the 1990s, that philosophy became the company's saving grace. While competitors chased maximalist trends, elaborate prints, and over-the-top branding, Calvin Klein stripped everything down to clean lines, neutral tones, and a logo so simple it fit on a single elastic waistband. It worked. Through the late 1990s, the underwear licensing deal with Warnaco that David Geffen had helped broker turned into an enormous, steady revenue engine. The CK sportswear line found a new generation of customers. The fragrance division, powered by the ongoing success of CK1, kept growing. Slowly, methodically, Calvin Klein Industries clawed its way from a company that had been $62 million in debt back into one of the most profitable privately held fashion houses in America. By the early 2000s, Klein and Schwartz, the same two men who had started this entire journey with a $10,000 loan and a rented showroom in 1968, were sitting on a company valuable enough to attract serious corporate interest. And in December of 2003, they finally sold Calvin Klein Inc. to Philips Van Huysen Corporation in a deal worth $400 million in cash, $30 million in stock, and up to $300 million more in potential royalties and performance bonuses. All told, the deal was worth as much as $700 million. $700 million. From $10,000. From a grocery store in Harlem and a childhood in the Bronx, where Klein used to sit alone, sewing, while other kids played ball outside. And this is remarkable when you actually sit with it, because remember the flaw that everyone assumed would hold him back, the quiet, sensitive kid who wasn't tough enough for the cutthroat world of 7th Avenue, the grocer's son with no fashion pedigree and no family connections in an industry built on exactly those things. That perceived weakness, that outsider's sensitivity, turned out to be the very thing that let him see fashion differently than everyone else. It let him see that jeans could be sexy, that a scent could ignore gender entirely, that simplicity, not embellishment, was the real language of luxury. The loner with the sketchbook had been right the whole time. When asked later in life to sum up his approach to design, Klein put it simply, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." That sentence could just as easily describe his approach to business. It wasn't enough for Calvin Klein to look successful. The company had to actually function. through junk bonds and federal investigations and rehab stints and boardroom crises. And somehow, again and again, it did. Today, decades after that grocery store in Harlem, the Calvin Klein name still sits on storefronts in more than 100 countries, still stitched onto the waistbands of underwear sold by the tens of millions every year, still printed across fragrance counters from New York to Tokyo to Dubai. The company Klein and Schwartz built survived a leveraged buyout gone wrong, a junk bond crisis, a federal obscenity investigation, and its founders' own very public struggles, and it came out the other side as one of the most durable names in the history of American fashion. Think about how many separate moments could have ended this story early. A rejected coat sample that never gets seen by the right buyer at Bonwit Teller. A jeans launch that flops instead of selling 200,000 pairs in a week. A leveraged buyout that collapses entirely instead of getting rescued by David Geffen's phone call. A federal investigation that goes the wrong way. Any single one of those moments, and you and I would probably never have heard the name Calvin Klein at all. But he kept surviving the unsurvivable, kept getting back up, kept trusting that the same eye that once saw beauty in his grandmother's tailoring shop could still see something worth building, even when the bankers and the headlines said otherwise. But Calvin Klein's legacy isn't really about the $62 million in debt, or the $700 million sale, or even the scandal in 1995 that nearly derailed everything. It's about what he proved along the way, that minimalism could be just as powerful, just as sensuous, just as commercially unstoppable as anything ornate or excessive. Before Klein, American fashion often looked to Paris for its cues. After Klein, the rest of the world started looking to America, to clean lines, to unisex fragrance, to the idea that a single well-cut pair of jeans with a name on the back pocket could define a decade. After the sale in 2003, Klein stayed on briefly as a design consultant before finally stepping back from the company that carried his name, trading 7th Avenue for a quieter life between Manhattan and the beaches of Fire Island and the Hamptons. He had spent nearly 4 decades in the spotlight, through the highs of Coty Awards and record-breaking jean sales, and through the lows of junk bonds, federal investigators, and rehab. Few designers ever get to walk away from that kind of pressure on their own terms. Calvin Klein did. He proved something else too, something that matters just as much as any sales figure. He proved that the perceived weakness everyone points to in you, too quiet, too sensitive, too different from what the industry expects, can quietly become your greatest advantage if you're stubborn enough to keep believing in it. A grocer's son from the Bronx, a boy who sewed while other kids played outside, built an empire that nearly collapsed under its own weight and rebuilt it anyway, on his own terms, with his own name on the label the entire time. And that's how a shy kid from a Bronx grocery store became one of the most powerful names in the history of fashion.